Thanks, Nick.
You're welcome.
It's hard to follow. I'm sure I'll be much drearier with that and be a bit of a policy nerd. Look, it's hard to try and condense something into about 10 minutes. So I've thought what I'll try and start with is, I think one of the problems we have getting decent policy around this in Australia, I think there's enough evidence out there that a bunch of people could easily put together the policy solutions that would rapidly deliver a big reduction in homelessness over the next 10 years. That would be easy. And the thing is that we're not able to do it. And I think one of the reasons we're not able to do it, although there is starting to be a shift, is about public understanding and public sympathy around homelessness. And I always start, David mentioned Matthew, and always it was Tony Abbott's policy response, I think, to homelessness is that the poor would always be with us. But when that's quoted, the homelessness have not always been with us. So we only go back, our organisation is a bit over 50 years old. And when we started, there were a very small number of people homeless. But and listen very carefully to this part, anyone who needed housing we could get. So there were people who were homeless, and what did they look like? The majority of them were in their mid-40s, they were men. They congregated around two pubs in the corner of Brunswick and Gertrude Street, the Rob Roy and the Champion. There are a few people in the room who might remember them.
Yes.
Well, one's now called the Newtown Workers Club, it's very hipster. But all of those people, if we could get them stabilised or whatever, we could fast track them into public housing. So housing wasn't the barrier to them resolving their homelessness. Now, if you look at, and I've brought this along, this is a fantastic book that our very first staff member wrote, and he was a great photographer. But that is Melbourne City Mission, a bunch of homeless men sitting there having a sermon so they can get their breakfast. And that was pretty much what the homelessness response was about that time. It was very paternalistic. It was all driven by the understanding, and there's lots and lots of evidence of this, that these people were fallen people, they were sinners. They were, they'd fallen from God, and therefore they'd ended up homeless, and all they needed to do was turn back to God. There's a great cartoon in there that says this very thing. Now, you don't have to be an historian to work out that these men, if they're in their mid-40s in 1963 or 64, what might have happened to most of them is that probably they were suffering from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder from World War II. But even our organisation didn't use language like that then. But I think that's really important, that if you go back, and it's very short, that in our mindset was that A, there was something wrong if you were homeless, there was something that you'd caused, and that it was driven really by issues like mental illness, drug and alcohol use, etc., etc. Now, we do, each year, we've had a really kind pro bono support from the National Research Company, and we check every 2 years the Australians' perception of homelessness. So what do Australians think or understand about homelessness? And it's really telling, and it's usually quite depressing when you read it, and it shows that people's thinking hasn't changed that much. We ask the question, why are people homeless? And the most common reason that's given is drug addiction, mental illness, and in the last survey for the first time, and this is, I think, due to the work of Rosie Batty, last time we did it was the first time family violence was mentioned in the top three. The least common answers or responses given is lack of opportunity or bad luck. Now, if you match those myths against the Institute of Health and Welfare data as around why people present for homeless support, The overwhelming reason is lack of affordable housing. Who'd have thought? Then family violence, then support with mental illness, loss of a job, then mental illness, then drug addiction, alcohol abuse, and they're the orders. And that's the data around presenting issues. So there's quite a mismatch in our mind. So I've become quite adept now when I've been doing this job for 12 years. In social situations, I'll often get asked, and it's almost like a whisper, why are people homeless? And so I just become a real smart ass now. I say, because they don't have a house. And yet we still want to think about all of these other things. Now, there's mounds of research now that shows, yes, there is a correlation between mental illness and drug and alcohol abuse and homelessness, but it's the other way around, that those problems have arisen as a result of being homeless, not the other way around. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is that for some reason, even though we're signed on to the Declaration of Human Rights, and Article 25 says that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including housing. And the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights says, Article 11, the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing and housing. We don't do it. Now, I don't know why, I don't know what's happened in the Australian psyche or in our history, but we do readily accept that without government support and intervention, almost none of us could access health services. We might be able, I'm on a wage, I could probably pay for a doctor's visit, I could pay for basic medications, but for most of us, including people who are middle class, a lot of health services out of reach, so we accept that the government subsidises that. Likewise with education. Most of us could not afford full cover of education. So the average funding, I think, the government funding now is about $8,000 a year per student in a primary school, 12,000, I'm perhaps being gonski ambitious there, it's about 12,000 in secondary schools, or that's what they're trying to get to. Many people couldn't afford that. So we accept that in order to do health and education, we have to have government support and intervention. But for some reason, and I don't know why, Australia has actively resisted that. And if you look at our data, even the US has more social housing than we do in big cities. It's hard to get a total figure for the US, but in Melbourne's particularly bad, but by way of example, in England, 17% of all housing in England is social housing. And in the biggest cities, in the boroughs in London, it's about 40%. In Australia, it's 4.3% of all housing is social housing. And Australia, with a population of 24 million, roughly, 24.5 million, 6,813 rough sleepers on census night 2011. England, with a population of 54.7 million people, 3,569 rough sleepers. And there's a big panic there because rough sleeping's increasing again. They're quite worried about it. But does anyone from Singapore here? Or does anyone know what the level of public housing is in Singapore?
80%.
85%, yeah. So for some reason Australia I don't know why, we're much more progressive, we're willing to subsidise, but we sit there with this glaring market failure happening. And then I would go to my work in part with Launch, but also chairing the Metropolitan Partnership. So this is a partnership that looks at planning, not planning, it looks at priorities for particular regions. And for my sins, I'm chairing the inner metro one, which covers the cities of Melbourne, Port Phillip and Yarra. And you just have to look out the window with what we're dealing with. Now, the overall theme of all of those partnerships and what Melbourne is dealing with is massive growth. and contest for space. So just look out the window here. And as that happens, and in a free market sense, as demand for this space becomes greater and greater, the cost of housing becomes more and more out of the reach of many people. There has been a shift, I think, in the discourse about housing and housing affordability in the last couple of years, in that it's moved away solely about mortgage. It's still there, but a lot of people under 30, 35, I don't think that they will ever own a house. But it's now looking at the cost of rental and the cost of rental accommodation. And not only that, again, if you go to the US, in many US cities, renters have far more protections than renters have here. There are things that makes economic neoliberal people, it makes their head spin, but rent control happens in lots of cities, in lots of big cities. There's much greater tenancy protection. So we've just let this really, really funny sort of housing system emerge with no coherent means of how we're going to subsidise or fund it. And now something happened around 2012 which has really started to put enormous pressure on. One of them I can demonstrate, and the other one I think we'll be able to demonstrate in a few months' time, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But two things happened in 2012. Housing prices and affordable housing. Something happened in 2012 and we started to see a rapid decline in the amount of affordable housing available in Melbourne, driven by the growth that we're seeing. And we're only now just getting a handle on the growth. And I don't think we're going to stop it, and I don't think necessarily that the growth's a bad thing, but we have to have better ways of managing it. And we have to be able to house people. But the other thing that happened in 2012 was large-scale welfare reform, where large numbers of people were moved from disability support pensions to New Start. And that, people in jobs think that's not a big thing. People in jobs think that that's not a huge drop. If you're living on New Start, the difference between a disability support pension and New Start allowance is massive. And given that there is almost no public housing available and the only option is to rent on the private market, what do you think was going to happen? So we have funded and we've contracted the University of New South Wales and the University of Queensland to do the Australian Homelessness Monitor. And we're waiting on the homeless census data as the final bit of data we need. But that will model changes in economy, but in particular changes in policy, and assess the impacts those changes have had on levels of homelessness. It's based on the UK Monitor. And what the UK Monitor has demonstrated overwhelmingly, that the cuts to welfare payments in the UK introduced through austerity measures has been the biggest driver of homelessness in the UK. So we suspect that this time in 6 months, 12 months' time, there will be greater evidence out there that the two big drivers of homelessness is lack of affordable housing and the cuts to welfare and the unsustainable levels of welfare payments. The other thing we need to do, and I'll finish off, I promised David I'd annoy everyone, but the things we need to do to resolve homelessness are really difficult, and they challenge left-wing thinking, they challenge right-wing orthodoxy. But I'll go to the right first. I think this audience, I'm going to have more fans if I criticise the right first. The right-wing thinking about the tax settings and negative gearing, it is just so wrong-headed, and you can't get an expert. I can't find any economist now who thinks it's a good thing. But the level of subsidy there, if that could be shifted over to fund this gap, yeah, we're paying huge amounts of money out in negative gearing, but it's doing nothing to fund the gap between market rent and what people can afford. Then the other thing we need to do and this is where I'll annoy the inner city left. We have to accept much higher levels of density in the inner city. It's absolute nonsense that I lived in West Melbourne, and for a few years I live in Carlton. In West Melbourne I was living in a street 500 metres from the central business district, and all of the dwellings were 1 story or 2 story. Yeah, everyone accepts that we have to go up, not out, where there's existing infrastructure. And if we just leave that going up, not out to the market, it'll be wealthy people or pretty cruddy small developments. And a huge part of that mix needs to be the serious government intervention to ensure that there's social and affordable housing within that. But you can't cut it any other way. Short of developing suburbs, just keeping on moving to where it's Seymour, but there is still an enormous amount of space that could be infilled in the city, and we have to accept that. So I'll finish there.